I'm really delighted to introduce Ellen Wermter, who's joining us today to talk about nutrition and IH. So complete switch in our brains there, moving to a more kind of practical everyday living. Quick intro, Ellen is a family nurse practitioner and diplomate in behavioral sleep medicine. She's also a fellow of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the owner of the medical director for Restorative Sleep Medicine in Charlottesville, Virginia. Ellen does provide comprehensive sleep care to patients in Virginia, including cognitive behavioral therapy for both insomnia and hypersomnia. And in addition to her clinical work, she is a regular contributor with the Better Sleep Council, as well as other media outlets about the science of sleep and healthy rest. A renowned sleep professional, Ellen provides expertise through educational learning, industry speaking engagements, and podcasting, blogging, webinars, and published presentations. But outside of all of that, she loves to enjoy nature walks with her dog and spending time with family. And she enjoys all types of sport, in particularly skiing and yoga. And Ellen, thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for asking me to come and talk today about nutritional considerations in hypersomnia. And I did title it that for a reason, and I'll talk about why that would be the case. So today, this is the quick agenda. We're going to have the intro and disclaimer, talk about how you can do a little bit of detective work, talk about some mechanisms behind why and how what you eat and your brain are connected. And then we'll get toward the end into some specific nutritional plans and we can call them recommendations. So for the intro, I like to tell people, because I have gotten asked to talk about nutrition several times, but I am not a nutritionist. I'm not a registered dietitian, so I will give that disclaimer. I am a nurse practitioner, so I have some nutrition training, of course, and I have extensive experience working with people with hypersomnia. So a lot of what I have learned about what might work or might not work has been from my patients, anecdotal evidence of when I do X, this is the type of result that I get. I see Y or Z. That said, all of you may have the fact that you have hypersomnia as a common denominator, but you all have very individual different medical histories. So some people have hypersomnia, specifically narcolepsy or IH, and other people, and plus diabetes or plus heart disease or plus hypertension. And other people might have different medical conditions. So when we're talking about a diet plan, it's important, or a nutritional plan, it's important to consult your medical provider that knows your medical history. So I don't have your chart in front of me. I don't know what other specific types of considerations we should be bringing into the equation when we talk about nutrition for you. Sorry. And those things are important. So just knowing that while these are some considerations for hypersomnia, we recognize that each of you is an individual with potentially other medical conditions that need to be considered as well. So looking at the big picture. And then the other thing I'd like to talk about in the intro and disclaimer is the evidence, which is that there isn't a lot of evidence. In fact, there's no study that says, people with hypersomnia should follow this diet. There have been some small studies that suggest improvements for certain types of diets, and there have been plenty of studies that can link associations between, we know that people with narcolepsy have a different microbiome, gut microbiome, and tend to have dysbiosis. And so there are studies showing that there are some connections there that might give us reasons for why the gut and brain connection is functioning the way it is or not functioning the way that we expect it to function. But we don't really have a full picture, nor do we have sort of a single solution for that. So the evidence is small. And so because of that, we do have to rely more on anecdotal evidence and on, just taking the best knowledge that we have and putting it to use. And one of the ways that we can do that is individual detective work. So this is the ultimate in do your own research. When we have studies and things, evidence that we see from studies, those are good, but that's population research. So we don't know specifically, for an individual, are you going to be in the majority where this study said, well, most people, this happens when they do X, or are you going to be an outlier? And we already know that by nature of having a hypersomnia condition, you are an outlier. You already have sort of a rare disease. So what I see working best with my patient population is to use some individual research and detective work about the individual triggers, the individual components that make a difference for you specifically. And when you're doing that, it's important, number one, to pick the right time to do it. In other words, you don't want to pick a time where you are changing a lot of other variables or have a lot of other things going on that are outside of the norm. So if you've just made a medication change or if you've just switched jobs, that's not a good time to try to figure out if you should eat gluten or not. That's a wonderful thing to sort of investigate, but you want to investigate it when there aren't a lot of other changing variables so that you can really get a better idea of, is this intervention the cause of the outcome? So pick a time when things are relatively stable, when there aren't as many changes that are happening in your life. And then you're going to keep track. Nobody likes to do this, me included, but it is vastly helpful. So when you do have a time where things are stable and you can keep a food diary, it's going to give you a lot of valuable information. So you can try any of the nutritional plans as long as it's okay with your specific medical provider that we're going to talk about. But when you do, it's good to make a note of how it makes you feel overall and any sort of positive or negative outcomes that you might have with that particular diet or nutritional plan. So keeping track, and nowadays we have so many apps that you can use for that, or you can just keep it simple and just write down, these are the things I'm eating and these are the symptoms I'm having. It's good to keep track of the time of day that you are eating and then when your slumps in your increase in daytime sleepiness are, so that you can see if there is a correlation there between I have this type of meal and then I have this type of level of alertness or sleepiness. Okay, so ultimately, I think your best outcome is going to be when you do your own detective work, when you take the time to do these sleep diaries, and when you pick the right time to do them where there aren't a lot of other variables or changes going on. So, what are some of the mechanisms that we're aware of that impact sort of where nutrition and hypersomnia meet? The simple mechanism is that the body and the brain need the right balance of nutrients in order to optimally function. So, if you're deficient in calcium or you're deficient in vitamin D, your cells in your body and your brain aren't going to be able to optimally function. So that's sort of pretty basic and applies to pretty every human. And then there are more complex sort of mechanisms that underlie things. And one of them is the gut-brain connection. You've probably heard of that. It's sometimes referred to as the gut-brain axis. There are also the connection of the neurotransmitters, because neurotransmitters are formed in the gut. The gut is responsible for about 90% of the serotonin that you make. And then there is this connection of dysbiosis that we'll talk about. So we're the gut-brain connection. The gut is known as the enteric nervous system, and it communicates bidirectionally with the central nervous system. It sends messages about nutrient availability, about the makeup of the microbiome, and the presence of inflammatory molecules. So your gut is talking to your brain, and your brain is talking to your gut. So they're formed from the same sort of neural tube, and they have a very robust type of communication system that goes both ways. Some examples of neurotransmitters that are made in the gut are GABA, and you're probably aware of GABA as an important neurotransmitter that's responsible for the HPA stress response. It's also responsible for memory synaptic plasticity. And so it calms the nervous system. It helps to regulate sleep. And so with the synaptic plasticity, it actually solidifies the memories more. So when GABA is infected, your memory is I'm sorry, affected, not infected. Your memory is affected. You're not able to solidify those memories as much as you can. And when GABA is affected, you're also having more of that stress response. So GABA is responsible for calming the nervous system, helping to regulate sleep. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. The other neurotransmitter that I mentioned before is serotonin, which is responsible for mood as well as alertness. And much of that neurotransmitter is made in the gut too. So the condition of our gut is important for several things because it communicates directly with our brain and because it is responsible for making these neurotransmitters that impact our sleep-wake system, our mood, our alertness. And then it's also important because of the dysbiosis. So they have done studies, and these are specifically in people with narcolepsy. I don't have data on the IH where we can see that there is an overgrowth of certain populations of micro or bacteria in people with narcolepsy, and then there is an undergrowth in other populations. And so there is this dysbiosis, and that can lead to increased pro-inflammatory factors, and pro-inflammatory factors impact the microglia in the brain and the mast cell activation part of your immune system. So there are real documented interactions that are going on between our gut and our brain and our mood and our sleepiness and all of those things, which is another reason why nutrition is so important and might have, a pretty good impact on the management of your care. So it's something that what my patients say is, when I'm paying good attention to this, I can tell that I do better. It's just really hard to maintain that. And I recognize that because it's hard for me, and I don't have all of the challenges of someone with a chronic disease. So, we'll talk a little bit about some helpers for that toward the end, but I do want to recognize that there are a lot of things we know and we want to be, better at, but having the bandwidth to do that is more difficult, right? So we're going to examine a few nutritional plans. The first one being the basic healthy diet, so all other things considered, what does that include? Then we're going to look at one called the low carbohydrate, high in good fats plan. We're going to touch on the keto. We're going to look at autoimmune paleo. And then we're going to talk about microbiome boosters and then avoiding triggers and the timing of meals. So basic healthy diet generally includes some lean proteins, your fish or chicken, things like that, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, probiotics and prebiotics. So when we talk about those gut microbiome and the just the wrong, overgrowth of some, undergrowth of others, sort of the wrong combo happening there, including probiotics and prebiotics is really important. Fiber is also really important because it mitigates some of when we have simple carbohydrates, the fiber can offset that a little bit. And of course, it has other sort of scrubbing sorts of properties that are really helpful. And then avoiding trans fats, saturated fats, processed foods, particularly ultra-processed foods, excess sodium, and in general, alcohol and caffeine, sort of trying to moderate those at least. So that's sort of the basic healthy diet, heart healthy diet. American Heart Association has a great one, as well as Mediterranean diet, are all good sort of standard choices. Now, if you want to get more specific, there there is some evidence, both study wise and anecdotally, that people with hypersomnia may do well with a diet that is low in carbohydrates and high in good fats. So this type of diet, where you're avoiding simple carbohydrates and you're focusing more on complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates have a high glycemic index, which means that it's going to cause a spike in the blood sugar in your system. And when you have that spike, your pancreas is going to release insulin to deal with the excess sugar. And when it suddenly gets that out of the bloodstream, then what you get is a crash. So you're having more variations in your blood sugar, and that is going to can cause increased sleepiness in many people. So when you eat the carbohydrate, you have the initial, increase in energy, but soon after you're going to have the decrease in energy as it pulls the sugar out of the bloodstream and processes it. You'll get the crash, and then subsequently you'll also want to crash sort of, from an alertness standpoint. Lean proteins and healthy fats are kind of key to this diet. And so we're talking about fish, lean chicken, nuts, avocados, and they can improve orexin sensitivity. So orexin being that neuropeptide. And we want to be sensitive to that, because that is what is mostly missing, we think, in type 1 narcolepsy. And it may be reduced or dysfunctional in other hypersomnia conditions as well. So we want to maximize that as much as we can. And so there are reasons why this diet is recommended, and and might be helpful for someone with hypersomnia. Keto is very similar in that it is also a low carbohydrate and high fat, and it's moderate protein, but it is a more restricted diet than just the sort of general low carb and high fat. So with keto, your goal is to get into this ketotic state, and by really reducing the amount of carbohydrates that you eat. And because of that restriction, it can leave you deficient in some things if you're not paying close attention to what you're eating, because you are cutting them out pretty much completely. And then you just have to be, careful with kidney functions and things like that. So there is some evidence that it can be helpful, but the evidence is limited and there are some drawbacks. So if it's something you want to try, make sure that you're an appropriate candidate to try it. And then meaning you don't have any, specific concerns that would make this take this off the table for you. And then just be aware that because of the restriction, you want to be very mindful of getting the right balance of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. And then there are also some people, because we believe that narcolepsy is an autoimmune disease. So why wouldn't we try a diet for people with autoimmune processes that are susceptible to that? So one example of that diet would be the anti-inflammatory paleo diet. So what this diet does is it focuses on whole foods and removal of inflammation causing foods. So you're eating a lot of leafy greens and vegetables, but not from the nightshade family. That's your tomatoes and that sort of thing. I think eggplants are nightshades too. Herbs and spices, you can add those. Fruits should be in the diet, but limited because of the sugar. And then lean, high quality animal proteins, beef, chicken, organ meats, fish, lamb. Animal proteins are best when grass-fed, wild-caught, or pasture-raised. And then fats like avocado oil, olive oil, coconut oil, and fermented food, which is going back to that, you know, the trying to boost the microbiome. You know, fermented foods tend to boost the microbiome. So now with the autoimmune I'm sorry, not autoimmune, anti-inflammatory paleo diet, there are things that they want you to avoid. So this is the avoid list. Grains, and some of these, you know, we consider healthy, but if you're doing this diet, basically you eliminate these and then you can reintroduce them one by one to see if in your case it causes inflammatory responses and changes sort of your, you know, relationship with, you know, that your outcomes, so how you're doing during the day. So grains, dairy, beans and legumes, nightshade vegetables like potatoes, eggplants, peppers, etc. Eggs, alcohol, processed oils, processed foods and ingredients, added sugars, nuts and nut oils, seeds and seed oils, and seed spices. So this one is very different in that some of these things are on the green light list of other diets, and for this they have you try to eliminate all of these at first, and then let's say you are a fan of eggs or you are a fan of walnuts or something, then you could add these things back in and see if I add my pinto beans back in, because pintos have great fiber, have great protein, they are a healthy food. They just may be inflammatory for you. And so basically you would add it back in and then you would see if there's a change with adding that back in. So that's how this diet works. And some people really feel like once they identify their triggers and they're able to know I can have XYZ, but not ABC, then their gut functions better. They have fewer, you know, gut symptoms, maybe dyspepsia or IBS type symptoms or things like that. But maybe they have better sustained wakefulness. Maybe they have better sleep-wake regulation as well. So common triggers that we see in people with autoimmune conditions and also with hypersomnia is gluten. Gluten is connected to celiac disease. And so many people can tolerate it fine, but other people cannot. So that is something that commonly people will do a trial off of to see if it does make a difference. Another trigger can just be eating too much at one time or eating too close to bedtime or eating a big meal prior to a time of day that is your slump. In other words, if you're always super sleepy between 2 and 4, if you eat a big lunch at 1 o'clock, that's probably going to make it worse. So really paying attention to, are you a person who needs to have smaller, more frequent meals in order to maintain your blood sugar at a more consistent level? Is that something that makes a difference for you? Another thing that I feel like is important is consistency of timing of the meals. And that's because when we think about, uh, managing hypersomnia disorders and having all that sleep wake instability, one of the best behavioral things you can do for management of hypersomnia is to have a really predictable routine and a predictable schedule. So set wake up times, knowing when you're going to be winding down, knowing when you're going to be exercising, knowing when you're going to be interacting with people and needing to have that alertness. But also meal times are a Zykeber. They are an input into the circadian rhythm. And if they're all over the place, some days I eat at this time, some days I eat at another time, then you're not giving your circadian rhythm strong cues. And really with the instability that's already there, you want to provide as many strong cues as you can. And this is another opportunity to do that. So I think consistency of the meal timing is really important for management too, and that people do see improvement when they keep track of their eating schedule and, have a relatively predictable time when they're going to be having their meals. Now, I told you I was going to give you potentially some tips for, how to make all this possible. I think the biggest one I've learned from my patients is to plan ahead. So when you get home from work and you're starving, and you don't have a plan and you're sleepy, it's going to be really hard to come up with one, something healthy, but also to be able to follow any sort of nutritional plan. So if you can invest the help of your loved ones, or even not, if you can just set aside a time each week, every Sunday morning at 10 a.m., I sit down and I make my grocery shopping list. And the grocery shopping list is based on the meal list for the week. These are the 4 meals that I'm going to prepare, and the other 3 nights of the week are going to be leftover nights. Or these are the lunches that I want to get ready. And then when you get back from the grocery store, prepping out as much as you can. Some people like to have a Monday, we're going to have X, Tuesday, we're going to have X. Other people like to have a list of these are the 4 meals. I'll sort of decide day to day which one it's going to be. But you have to remember to, if you're thawing out meat, to take that out in the morning. So the other big friend, I think, it can be slow cookers. So especially if you're a person with hypersomnia who has more energy in the morning, a slow cooker can be your friend, because you can prep and put everything in the crock pot before you leave. And when you get home, it's pretty much ready to go. Now, if you're a person who has a ton of sleep inertia and mornings are really, really rough, then maybe an air fryer's for you, something where, or an Instapot that you can put, on when you get home, and it cooks things very quickly. So think about the sort of style of cooking that you're going to be doing, and some of the tools that might be helpful based on when your symptoms are the worst, and when you're going to have the most energy to make these decisions and carry out the preparation and the planning. But and I used to resist it very much, but what I would find, just because nobody wants to sit down and do it, but I would find the weeks that I did it, the entire week would go much more smoothly, because I did have that plan in place. I had thought about it ahead of time, and I'd even maybe gotten some things ready ahead of time. So think about those things. I think it's sometimes helpful as well to have a short list of your favorites. So if your brain's not working, I don't know what to cook, you have your short list ready. I think any prepared meals that you can make and freeze are helpful, because then they're ready to go. And I also think sometimes we need inspiration. So, maybe getting a newsletter that gives you ideas, that just gets delivered and you can scan it. And if you don't have time to scan it or energy to scan it, you can delete it. But on days where you're looking for ideas, you might catch a couple that are interesting to you, or that you might, because we all get bored with some of the same things. So having something for inspiration can be helpful. Some websites that you can go to when you're looking for new ideas and sharing ideas and recipes with other people. I think those can be helpful as well. Okay, so pretty sure this is my last slide. And I put this in here to address the dysbiosis. So we know that the overgrowth of certain bacteria and undergrowth of other bacteria are there. So we want to pay attention to our microbiome. Unfortunately, we don't know individual to individual what the population is. I feel like that's coming. I feel like at some point we're going to be able to provide a sample and see what the overgrowth is and see what the undergrowth is, and then be able to sort of have a personalized group of lactobacillus or whatever it is that we're going to put in there to try to, right the ship and make the right combination that all get along together in there. But until then, there are things that we know support a healthy microbiome, and that is on this list here. And so limiting high sugar foods, having diversity in the diet, so eating the rainbow. Plants are generally a good bet for microbiome. Prebiotics, those are things like onions and garlic, vegetables, high fiber foods. Probiotics, that's your kimchi, your fermented foods, your sauerkrauts, your yogurts, your kombuchas, things like that. Yogurt, sourdough, other fermented food. And then we can actually impact our microbiome outside of our diet too by getting regular exercise and by dealing with our stress in a good way and by limiting alcohol. So those are also inputs into your microbiome. Those affect the makeup of your microbiome. And so those are things that you can pay attention to besides what you're eating and preparing. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Ellen. That's so informative. And I was actually going to ask you about kombucha, but you even hit that on the last slide there, because that's
mine right here.
Popular in my house. But we do have a couple of questions and still want to invite people to drop a couple of questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with this one. What makes food an inflammatory food?
What makes a food an inflammatory food? That's a good question. I don't really know. All I know is that that anti-inflammatory diet, they've done some research to show that these particular foods do cause inflammation in a certain number, in enough people that they would put them on the eliminate list, and then they would have you sort of add them back in when you want to do a trial of them to see if for you it causes the inflammation process.
So it sounds like it's quite specific to the individual and not just a generic list of these things are going to be inflammatory in everyone. That's quite difficult to navigate, isn't it? Okay, it's a great question though. Okay.
And that's why I talked about doing the detective work, because something that I tolerate well, my husband may not, or something that he tolerates well, I may not. And so there are some things that I can sort of get away with eating. And I don't mean necessarily even bad foods. These might be healthy foods, but my system accepts them, digests them well, does not have an inflammatory response to them. And that might not be the case for someone else, another individual.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Christy, and she asks, do most IH patients feel worse when they eat large meals? When I eat a large meal at any time, I feel like I go into a quote unquote food coma, and I struggle to stay awake and or be productive. I've been a vegetarian for 37 years. The Mediterranean diet helps me feel best, but I eat very small portions. What are your comments there? There's quite a lot there, isn't there?
First, I would say bravo, because she figured out, that whenever I have a large meal, I do feel like I'm in a food coma. And that's one of the questions on the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, because some people have that trigger and some people don't. So it's sort of like, how likely would you be to fall asleep after you've eaten a lunch with no alcohol, like sitting quietly after a meal with no alcohol? And the one of the reasons that's on there is because for some people that's going to be really high. Food is a very big trigger for that, and that can vary over the lifespan. Like you may regulate that better at certain times of night. I know, or times of your life. I know when I was in college, I must have been very sensitive to it, because every time I would eat my lunch, my 1 o'clock class, I was just so sleepy during my 1 o'clock class. And so I really did feel like it was in response to the meal that I just had. That is also a common time of day to be sleepy. So you have the meal, and then you have your biological sort of dip in sleepiness at that time. But I just remember being much more sensitive to it at that time in my life than I necessarily am now. I probably was eating a bigger lunch than I do now too, though. So, because some of it could have been, what I was eating or the amount that I was eating. But generally, when you have to digest a lot, and your system is responding to that, and having to work on that digestive process, a lot of people do feel like they get that postprandial dip, that post-meal slump. And if you are in that category, then I think modifying the way that this client did, is smart, and then finding the type of diet that works best to manage your symptoms. Yeah.
Super helpful. Okay, so Taylor asked, thank you for the info. She actually says this was really helpful. You did talk about probiotic and prebiotic foods. What do you think about probiotic supplements? Is that a way to go?
I mean, that's always a tough question just because, like most other supplements, they're not regulated. So we don't really know if what it says is what's in there. And but at the same time, also they're giving you sort of the most common sort of good bacteria, but because what we're adding it to is sort of probably not in the normal range, it's sort of like what will happen. I mean, I kind of think of it as a game of Risk. You're supposed to you have all these countries, and then this country gets sort of built up and it's going to take over this country here, and you don't know kind of what the big picture is. That's where I would say one that's maybe some of these have extra.
I think we just lost Ellen, unfortunately, because she was just halfway through a question. Hopefully she'll rejoin. There you are.
It just completely dropped out. Sorry.
Okay, you're all good.
Some supplement companies will have independent testing to verify that what they're selling, is what it is. So you could try to find one that has some of that verification, and then you can do a trial of, I'm going to take this probiotic, every night for 2 weeks, and I'm going to see if it makes any difference. So, I'm not against them at all. I just think it's sort of a big question mark. We don't really know. And certainly I wouldn't say to spend money on them if you don't notice any change in how you feel.
Yeah. There's a lot of options out there. It's quite overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. There's so many things. Yes, it's very overwhelming.
Okay, last question I think that we've got time for. What symptoms should we look for as we reintroduce the foods that indicate it might be causing inflammation?
Yeah, I think the obvious ones are the GI symptoms, right? So, upset stomach, dyspepsia, lots of gas, lots of bloating, diarrhea, constipation, any of the GI symptoms are saying, trying to tell you, I don't like this. You can also look for just your general overall fatigue level, sleepiness level, that type of thing, because most people, even if you can't quantify it, you can tell if you're off or not. So that's a little, I recognize that's a little nebulous, but we know generally when we're feeling, some days we feel better than others. And even though that's sort of a generalized feeling, I think that if it were something that would be causing inflammation, you would probably be aware of the change. Even if you weren't having the GI symptoms. But those would be the ones that I would look for first. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like listen to your body. We could keep talking for ages, and I know there's a lot more questions. I'm really sorry that we're a little bit out of time, but I'm super glad this is recorded. Again, thank you, Ellen, because you've showed up more than once for our community through the Hypersomnia Foundation, and we always learn so much when you present up-to-date material, and it's just very inspiring. I've got lots of notes right here. I'm going to work on some of my dietary things as well. So thank you.